The Petroleum Warfare Department, PWD, was an organization established in Britain in 1940 in response to the invasion crisis during World War II, when it appeared that Germany would invade the country. The department was initially tasked with developing the uses of petroleum as a weapon of war, and it oversaw the introduction of a wide range of flame warfare weapons. Later in the war, the department was instrumental in the creation of the Fog Investigation and Dispersal Operation, commonly known as FIDO, that cleared runways of fog, allowing the landing of aircraft returning from bombing raids over Germany in poor visibility, and Operation Pluto, which installed prefabricated fuel pipelines between England and France soon after the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Inception. At the beginning of World War II, in September 1939, there was little fighting in the West until the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940. Following the fall of France and the withdrawal of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, from the beaches at Dunkirk in June 1940, Britain was threatened with possible invasion by German armed forces in 1940 and 1941. In response to this threat of invasion, the British sought to expand the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force and Army, and to replace the equipment that had been left behind at Dunkirk. Also, to supplement the regular armed services with volunteer organizations such as the part-time soldiers in the Home Guard. With many types of equipment in short supply, there were frantic efforts to develop new weapons, particularly those that did not require scarce materials. Although oil imports from the Middle East had stopped and most oil for Britain came from the United States, there was at this time no shortage of oil. Supplies originally intended for Europe were filling British storage facilities, and there were full tankers kept waiting in American ports. The amount of petrol allocated for civilian use was strictly rationed, and pleasure motoring was strongly discouraged. This was not, at least initially, because of a shortage of petrol, but because it might lead to large congregations of well-fueled vehicles at popular places. In the event of an invasion, the British would be faced with the problem of destroying this embarrassment of riches lest it should prove of use to the enemy, as it had in France. By mid-June, as a basic anti-invasion precaution, wayside petrol stations near the coast had been emptied, or at least had their pumps disabled, and garages everywhere were required to have a plan to prevent their stocks being of use to the invader. On May 29, 1940, as the evacuation of the BEF was in progress, Maurice Hankey, then a cabinet minister without portfolio, joined the Ministerial Committee on Civil Defence, CDC, chaired by Sir John Anderson, the Secretary of State for the Home Office and Home Security. Among many ideas, Hankey brought out of his stable a hobby horse which he had ridden very hard in the 1914-18 war, namely the use of burning oil for defensive purposes. Hankey believed that oil should not just be denied to an invader, but used to impede him. Towards the end of June, Hankey brought his scheme up at a meeting of the Oil Control Board and produced for Commander-in-Chief Home Forces Edmund Ironside extracts of his paper on experiments with oil in the First World War. On June 5, Churchill authorized Geoffrey Lloyd, the Secretary for Petroleum, to press ahead with experiments, with Hankey taking the matter under his general supervision. Donald Banks. Donald Banks, 1891–1975, had served with distinction in World War I, winning the DSO and MC. He had joined the civil service, and in 1934 he was made Director General of the Post Office. He then moved to the Air Ministry and served there as Permanent Under-Secretary from 1936–38. Due to overwork, Banks was given lighter duties, including a mission to Australia to advise on aircraft production and a job at the Import Duties Advisory Committee. During this period, Banks had remained on the rolls of the Territorial Army Reserve of Officers, and when hostilities broke out in September 1939, the Advisory Committee was abolished and he was free to serve in the armed forces. Banks was soon posted as Air Attaché to the Quartermaster General of 50th, Northumbrian, Infantry Division, a first-line division of the Territorial Army. Banks got on well with his commander, Gifford Le Quesne Martel, and he admired his leadership and his enthusiasm for experimentation and improvisation. In October 1939, the division was sent to the Cotswolds, and in January 1940 it was moved to France. When Germany attacked in May, the division was heavily involved in the fighting around Arras and was later withdrawn to the coast. Banks later recalled looking out to sea from a cliff top and seeing an awe-inspiring sight a few miles away: an oil tanker had been bombed or had struck a mine. Masses of the blackest smoke pillared up into a gigantic pall in the sky, while in the vast lake of fire, spreading it seemed for miles on the water, a flame blazed and leapt like an angry volcano. I was often to recall that scene in subsequent days of flame warfare. The division was evacuated to England. Early in July 1940, Donald Banks was summoned to the presence of Geoffrey Lloyd, who explained the vision that he and Hankey shared: "Flame all across Britain," he said, "ringing the coasts, spurting from the hedges and rolling down the hills. We will burn the invader back into the sea." Considering Lloyd's ideas over the next few days, Banks consulted with other soldiers. He found both professional skepticism and enthusiasm. Banks, a man who said he preferred the prospect of real fighting over Whitehall warfare, was not himself keen, and his first instinct was to suggest that petroleum weapons should be developed locally. Lloyd would have none of it, and Banks was ordered to report to him for special duties. On July 9, cutting through red tape, the Petroleum Warfare Department was created. Banks was in charge and he would never look back again. The Petroleum Warfare Department started on July 9, 1940 in 3 small rooms. They were independently administered and financed, but with a tiny staff entirely lacking in technical knowledge. They were fired only by the infectious enthusiasm of Lloyd and Hankey. Flame traps. Hankey and Lloyd were not alone in their interest in the development of petroleum warfare weapons. Encouragement came from the highest quarters. In August, a note from the Chief Engineer's office at GHQ Home Forces read, "The PM is personally interested in it. It is something which can be provided without any adverse effect on the production of other equipment or on our war effort generally. It is unlikely that we shall have enough A/T weapons to cover all our roadblocks for many months, if ever. These flame traps do at least give the Home Guard a sporting chance of frying a few Germans." PWD took inspiration from events that happened during the retreat to Dunkirk in June 1940. One example occurred when Boulogne was attacked in the early hours of 23 May and the road to Calais was cut. In the defense of Boulogne, a group of pioneers under Lieutenant Colonel Donald Dean VC, had improvised a roadblock made of vehicles and piles of furniture from bombed-out houses. An approaching tank began to push its way over the obstruction, as Dean wrote. "We were prepared for this. I had some lorry petrol tanks punctured with a pick, the tank being unable to shell us during its crushing climb, and we set fire to the lot. A sheet of flame went up, and the tank backed hastily off. Our roadblock burned for quite a while, and allowed for a further block to be made under cover of smoke. The newly formed department quickly made arrangements for some practical experiments at Dumpton Gap in Kent. These were the source of some excitement for witnesses, who included the pilots of enemy planes. Many of the first ideas to be tried proved fruitless, but experience quickly led to the development of the first practical weapon, the static flame trap. Static flame trap. A static flame trap allowed a length of road, typically 60 to 150 feet, 18 to 46 meters, to be covered in flame and smoke at a moment's notice. The weapon was a simple arrangement of perforated pipes placed alongside a road. The pipes were steel, 1 to 2 inches in diameter, and drilled with 1/8 inch holes at angles carefully calculated to cover the road evenly. The perforated pipes were connected to larger pipes that led to a tank of fuel in a raised position. The fuel mixture was 25% petrol and 75% gas oil that was contrived to be of no use as motor vehicle fuel should it be captured. All that was required to trigger the weapon was to open a valve and for a home guardsman to throw in a Molotov cocktail, creating an inferno. The ideal location for the trap was a place where vehicles could not easily escape, such as a steep-sided sunken road. Some trouble was taken with camouflage. Pipes could be hidden in gutters or disguised as handrails, others were simply left as innocent-looking plumbing. All the required pipes and valves could be obtained from the gas and water industries with little modification required beyond drilling a few holes. In general, gravity was all that was required to provide sufficient pressure for the fountains of oil, but where necessary pumps were provided. Later versions were a little more sophisticated. Remote ignition could be achieved in a variety of ways. In one system, called the Birch Igniter, the pressure of the oil at the end of the pipe would squeeze glycerin from a rubber bulb. The glycerin would fall onto a container of potassium permanganate, which would then ignite spontaneously. Another method was to run a pair of small rubber tubes, down one of which would be passed acetylene and the other chlorine. When, at the far end, these two gases were allowed to mix, there would be a spontaneous ignition. This system had the advantage that it could be turned on and off repeatedly. The development of the flame fugace, see below, provided a method of remote electrical ignition that could only be used once, but was virtually instantaneous. Some 200 static flame traps were installed, mainly by the employees of oil companies whose services were placed at the disposal of the government. Mobile flame traps. In addition to the static flame traps, mobile units were created. The main design used an otherwise redundant 200-300 imperial gallon, 910-1,360 L, tank mounted on the back of a 30 cwt lorry, just behind the cabin. In the middle of the remaining space was a petrol-driven pump, and either side of this was stored 75 feet, 23 meters, of armored rubber hose. Two nozzles were provided with a primitive sight and with spikes for pushing into the ground. Gas tubes for chlorine and acetylene gas were provided for ignition. The resulting jets of flame had a range of 60-70 feet, 18-21 m. Because there was a shortage of pumps, they were badly needed for fighting fires started by bombing. A simpler type of mobile flame trap was also designed. This consisted of a number of 12-inch, 30 cm, diameter pipes welded shut to make a 12-foot, 3.7 m, long cylindrical drum which was filled with 43 imperial gallons, 200 liters, of gasoline oil mixture and pressurized with an inert gas. A number of these cylinders could be transported on the back of a vehicle and, at a weight of just under 1,000 pounds, 450 kilograms, could be deployed reasonably quickly wherever an ambush was required. The cylinders would be placed at intervals along a road, each with a short length of hose leading to a nozzle secured by ground spikes. Flow was initiated by a pull string that opened a valve, and ignition was provided by Molotov cocktails. Flame fugace. The Petroleum Warfare Department soon received the assistance of Henry Newton and William Howard Livens, both known for designing mortars during the First World War. During the First World War, Livens had developed a number of chemical warfare and flame-throwing weapons. His best-known invention was the Livens projector, a simple mortar that could throw a projectile containing about 30 pounds, 14 kilograms, of explosives, incendiary oil or, most commonly, poisonous phosgene gas. The great advantage of the Livens projector was that it was cheap. This allowed hundreds, and on occasions thousands, to be set up and then fired simultaneously, catching the enemy by surprise. Both Livens and Newton experimented with field-expedient versions of the Livens projector using commercially available 5-gallon drums and tubes. Newton experimented with firing milk bottles filled with phosphorus using a rifle. None of these experiments were taken forward. One of Livens' PWD demonstrations, probably first seen about mid-July at Dumpton Gap, was particularly promising. A barrel of oil was blown up on the beach. Lloyd was said to have been particularly impressed when he observed a party of high-ranking officers witnessing a test from the top of a cliff making an instantaneous and precipitate movement to the rear. The work was dangerous. Livens and Banks were experimenting with 5-gallon drums in the shingle at Hythe when a short circuit triggered several weapons. By good fortune, the battery of drums where the party was standing failed to go off. The experiments led to a particularly promising arrangement, a 40-gallon steel drum buried in an earthen bank with just the round front end exposed. At the back of the drum was an explosive which when triggered ruptured the drum and shot a jet of flame about 10 feet, 3.0 m, wide and 30 yards, 27 m, long. The design was reminiscent of a weapon dating from late medieval times called a fugace, a hollow in which was placed a barrel of gunpowder covered by rocks, the explosives to be detonated by a fuse at an opportune moment. Livens' new weapon was duly dubbed the flame fugace. The flame fugace was demonstrated to Clement Attlee, Maurice Hankey, and General Liardet on July 20, 1940. A variant of the flame fugace called the demi-gas was a fugace barrel placed horizontally in the open with an explosive charge underneath that would rupture the barrel and flip it over towards the target. Another variant was the hedge hopper, a fugace barrel on its end with an explosive charge underneath that would send it bounding over a hedge or wall. This made the hedge hopper particularly easy to conceal. A further variant of the hedge hopper idea was devised for St. Margaret's Bay, where the barrels would be sent rolling over the cliff edge. In all, some 50,000 flame fugace barrels were distributed, of which the great majority were installed in one of 7,000 batteries, mostly in southern England, and a little later at 2,000 sites in Scotland. Some barrels were held in reserve while others were deployed at storage sites to destroy fuel depots at short notice. The size of a battery varied from just one drum to as many as 14. A 4-barrel battery was the most common installation and the recommended minimum. Where possible, half the barrels in a battery were to contain the 40/60ths mixture and half the sticky 5B mixture. Troubled waters. Operation Lucid. A series of experiments investigated the possibility of burning the invaders' barges before they could reach the English shore. The first idea was simply to explode a vessel filled with oil, and this was tried at Maplin Sands, where a Thames oil tanker, Suffolk, with 50 tons of petroleum was blown up in shallow water. Another idea developed was that the oil should be held in place on the water by a trough formed from coir matting. A machine formed the trough from a flat mat as it was paid out over the stern of a ship. Trials with the Benhan produced a flaming ribbon 880 yards long and 6 feet wide, 800 m x 2 m, that could be towed at 4 knots. Neither of these experiments were carried forward to produce workable defenses. The Suffolk did, however, provide a trial run for an even more ambitious idea: the invasion barges would be burned even before they left port. The plan was first floated in early June/July 1940 and became known as Operation Lucid. 3 old tankers were quickly prepared for the operation under the command of Augustus Agar. Although the operation was started several times, each attack was thwarted by bad weather, unreliable ships, and finally, by the command ship hitting a mine. The operation was eventually called off. Burning seas. During August, the corpses of about 40 German soldiers were washed up at scattered points along the coast between the Isle of Wight and Cornwall. The Germans had been practicing embarkations in the barges along the French coast. Some of these barges put out to sea in order to escape British bombing and were sunk, either by bombing or bad weather. This was the source of a widespread rumor that the Germans had attempted an invasion and had suffered very heavy losses either by drowning or by being burnt in patches of sea covered with flaming oil. We took no steps to contradict such tales, which spread freely through the occupied countries in a wildly exaggerated form and gave much encouragement to the oppressed populations. Winston Churchill. From its earliest days, the Petroleum Warfare Department experimented with setting the sea on fire by burning oil that was floating on the surface. It was immediately appreciated that the possibilities of such a weapon lay not only in its ability to destroy the enemy but in the propaganda value of the terror of fire. In 1938, an enemy publicity section created for propaganda to be sent to the enemy was formed by Lord Hankey, and a new section was formed under Sir Campbell Stewart, who was a former editor of the Times newspaper. Being allocated premises at Electra House, the new section was dubbed Department Et. During the Munich crisis of 1938, a number of leaflets were printed with the intention of dropping them over Germany. The leaflet drop never took place, but the exercise prompted Department A to issue a note to the Air Ministry insisting on the importance of a properly coordinated system for sending information to enemy countries. The permanent secretary, most senior civil servant of a department, at the Air Ministry to whom the note was addressed was none other than Sir Donald Banks, who would later head the PWD. On September 25, 1939, Department A was mobilized to Woburn Abbey, where it joined another subversion team known as Section D that had been formed by Major Lawrence Grand. In July 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill invited Hugh Dalton to take charge of the newly formed Special Operations Executive, SO. The mission of the SO was to encourage and facilitate espionage and sabotage behind enemy lines, or, as Churchill put it, to set Europe ablaze. Among those present at the first summit meeting of SO on July 1, 1940 were Lord Hankey, Geoffrey Lloyd, and Desmond Morton, people who would be instrumental in the formation of the Petroleum Warfare Department just a few days later. Department E and Section D later became SO1 and SO2 of the SO. Subsequently, in September 1941, responsibilities for political warfare would be taken away from the SO with the formation of the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. Although PWD would go on to work on burning floating oil, a plan was hatched to spread the story that such a weapon already existed even before the first trials were performed. Writer James Hayward has made an extensive study of this curious story. In The Bodies on the Beach, Hayward makes a compelling case for the view that the Burning Seas work was driven substantially by the needs of propaganda and was a sophisticated bluff that became Britain's first major propaganda success of the war. Writing just after the war, Banks admitted perhaps the greatest contribution from all these variegated efforts was in building up the great propaganda story of the flame defense of Britain, which swept the continent of Europe in 1940. The details of the story indicated the invention of a bomb that would spread a thin film of volatile liquid on the surface of the water and then ignite it. This rumor was whispered into attentive ears in neutral cities such as Stockholm, Lisbon, Madrid, Cairo, Istanbul, Ankara, New York, and other places, probably around late July or early August 1940. The Burning Seas rumor appealed to the dark imaginations of both friend and foe. Soon, interrogation of captured Luftwaffe pilots revealed that the rumor had become common knowledge. German armed forces began experimenting with burning floating oil. On August 18 they ignited 100 tons of floating oil. It burned for 20 minutes, producing heat and copious smoke. This was almost a week before the first successful British ignition. In Europe, the Burning Seas story became embellished to the point where the story included a German invasion attempt thwarted by the ignition of oil on water. American war correspondent William Lawrence Shire, 1904–1993, was based in Berlin at the time, but in mid-September he visited the city of Geneva in Switzerland. News coming over the nearby border of France is that the Germans have attempted a landing in Britain, but that it has been repulsed with heavy German losses. Must take this report with a grain of salt. On the evening of the following day Shire arrived back in Berlin. I noticed several lightly wounded soldiers, mostly airmen, getting off a special car which had been attached to our train. From their bandages, the wounds looked like burns. I noticed also the longest Red Cross train I've ever seen. It stretched from the station for half a mile to beyond the bridge over the Landwehr Canal. I wondered where so many wounded could have come from, as the armies in the West stopped fighting 3 months ago. As there were only a few porters, I had to wait some time on the platform and picked up a conversation with a railway workman. He said most of the men taken from the hospital train were suffering from burns. Can it be that the tales I heard in Geneva had some truth in them after all? The stories there were that either in attempted German raids with sizable landing parties on the English coast or in rehearsals with boats and barges off the French coast the British had given the Germans a bad pummeling. The reports reaching Switzerland from France were that many German barges and ships had been destroyed and a considerable number of German troops drowned, also that the British used a new type of wireless directed torpedo, a Swiss invention, the Swiss said, which spread ignited oil on the water and burned the barges. Those cases of burns at the station this morning bear looking into. The following day, Shire heard about further train loads of wounded soldiers. A plausible explanation for these wounded is that they were hurt in RAF bombing raids on ports of embarkation. Such raids were certainly going on, though it seems they were generally fairly ineffective and no records of significant German casualties have been turned up. It seems likely that the rumor machine inflated light casualties to proportions of strategic consequence. The British were getting better organized. A system was set up to collect suggestions for inspired rumors. These suggestions, which became known as sibs, from the Latin sibillare, to hiss. Sibs were sifted through at weekly meetings in order that they should present a consistent message and to ensure that ludicrously improbable and inadvertently true rumors were filtered out. New sibs included small-scale attempts at invasion have been made and have been beaten off with devastating losses. In fact, none are alive to tell. Thousands of floating German corpses have been washed ashore, and the fishing populations of the west coast of Denmark and the south coast of Norway are selling fish, but they won't eat them. The reason is that there are numbers of German corpses on which the fish feed. There have even been cases of shreds of clothing and buttons, etc. being found inside the fish. The story of the burning seas was further reinforced. In October, the RAF dropped leaflets containing handy phrases for visitors to the United Kingdom in German, French and Dutch. The phrases included: "The sea smells of petrol here, the sea even burns here, see how well the captain burns, Carl/Willy/Fritz/Johann/Abraham, cremated/drowned/minced by the propellers." As Hayward explains, these leaflets were simply building on and reinforcing the rumors of a failed invasion attempt that were being disseminated around the world from late September. The original propaganda was conflated with other events, both real and imaginary, and the rumors spread. Of course, the German command knew that the stories were untrue. The real targets of the propaganda were the men who might actually be asked to attempt a landing in England. Berlin felt forced officially to deny the rumors. Channel losses denied. Berlin, September 25. AP, authorized German sources said today that there was no truth in reports that many thousands of bodies of German soldiers were being washed ashore along the English Channel. Such accounts were declared to be an indication of a situation that compels the British to put out such silly lies. Inevitably, the story made its way back to the UK. Publication of the contents of propaganda leaflets dropped by the RAF were not permitted, and other stories, such as an official statement from the Free French Information Service through the Ministry of Information saying that 30,000 Germans drowning in an attempted embarkation last September, were suppressed. Vivid and plausible accounts of a thwarted invasion were published in American newspapers, and the rumors spread in Britain and proved persistent. Questions were even asked in Parliament. Writing just after the war, the chief press censor, Rear Admiral George Peary Thompson, said that, "In the whole course of the war there was no story which gave me so much trouble as this one of the attempted German invasion, flaming oil on the water and 30,000 burned Germans." On September 7, 1940, the Battle of Britain was still raging, but the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, changed its tactics and started to bomb London. With the accumulation of invasion barges and favourable tides, the authorities were convinced that invasion was imminent. The codeword Cromwell was passed to the Army and Home Forces. The codeword was only meant to indicate invasion imminent, but with a nation tense with expectation and some Home Guardsmen incompletely briefed, some believed that the invasion had started, and this caused great confusion. In some areas, church bells were rung on receipt of the codeword, even though this was only supposed to happen when invaders were in the immediate area. Roadblocks were set up, some bridges blown and landmines sown on some roads, killing 3 guards officers. Home Guard units searched beaches for invasion barges and scanned the skies for approaching German paratroopers, but none came. Public recollection of these events did much to reinforce the idea that some kind of landing had in fact been attempted. The burning sea lie provided the British with their first major black propaganda victory. The compelling story is likely to be the basis of a number of invasion myths that remained in circulation throughout the remainder of the 20th century, that the Germans attempted an invasion which was thwarted by the use of sea-burning bombs. The most persistent of these stories becoming known as the Shingle Street Mystery, named after an isolated village on the Suffolk coast. Flame barrage. Propaganda aside, the efforts of the PWD were real enough. They continued with experiments to actually set the sea on fire. Although initial tests were discouraging, Geoffrey Lloyd was reluctant to let the matter go. On August 24, 1940, on the northern shores of the Solent, near Titchfield, 10 tanker wagons began to pump oil down pipes running from the top of a 30-foot, 10 m, high cliff down into the water at the rate of about 12 tons per hour. In front of many spectators, the oil was ignited by flares in a system of sodium and petrol pellets. In a matter of seconds, a raging wall of flame was produced. The intense heat caused the water to boil and people at the cliff edge were obliged to retreat. The demonstration was very dramatic, but it was not an unqualified success because the circumstances were improbably favorable. In the sheltered waters of the Solent, the sun-warmed sea was calm and the winds light. A lengthy series of experiments continued with many reverses. In one case the pipes attached to Admiralty scaffolding, an anti-tank barrier of scaffolding placed in the shallows, were torn up in a storm, and in another incident sappers were blown up by beach mines. It was found that effectiveness was very much affected by sea conditions. A low temperature made ignition more difficult and waves would quickly break up the oil into small ineffectual slicks. On December 20, 1940, Field Marshals Alexander and Montgomery and many other senior officers gathered for a demonstration. The performance was completely unconvincing, with just a few small pools of burning oil battered by the surf. The cold, cloudy weather matched the mood of pessimism. Banks describes this day as the Black Friday in the annals of the Petroleum Warfare Department. General Alexander was sympathetic to the PWD's problems and suggested that the pipes be moved to a point immediately above the high tide point, and, after several months of further work, this proved to be the solution: oil sprayed and burnt over rather than on the water. On 24 February.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.